I'm going to take you through the most spectacular game from round 2 of the Tata Steel tournament. And it's between Alexander Donchenko playing white against Fabiano Caruana playing black. Donchenko from Germany was a last-minute replacement for Daniel Dubov, who decided not to travel in the end because someone close to him had tested positive for COVID, and he thought it best for all concerned that he didn't travel. Very sensible. So anyway, we have Donchenko, 22 years old, German number 2. He's been having some good results recently. So interesting to see him play in the Tata Steel top tournament, which is a real test for him. And it's a Slav, and Caruana played this in the candidates tournament last March, so really interesting to see him repeat this opening. He's not afraid to show potential opening secrets. I find that very interesting. This idea with knight h4 hits this bishop. Basically, white is chasing that bishop down and grabs the two bishops. Black provokes f3 before going back to g6 because that just weakens e3 a little bit. That can be significant later on. Can be useful for white to have that pawn on f3 to support g4 or e4, but anyway, it's probably sensible for black to play bishop e4. And now, those of you with a good memory will remember that Dverny played queen b3 here against Shirov in that spectacular queen-sack game. But bishop d2 was the move that Caruana faced in the candidates against Anish Giri. It's already an interesting position. So we have this two bishops against bishop and knight contest. That's one thing. But also it's not exactly clear where black's king is going to go, particularly after white castles, because of course if the king rushes towards the king side, then white will rush those pawns up the board and break things open. So for the moment, black actually hangs back with the king. Now in that game, Giri against Caruana went knight b6, and Giri actually got a winning position but didn't quite clinch it. In this game, Caruana played a6, potentially preparing b5, much as Shirov did actually. g4 looks reasonable. You never know. It could be the start of a pawn storm on the king side, or sometimes it could be that white simply wants to push that knight out of the way. Pawn takes pawn on c4, bishop takes c4 and b5. So Caruana starting this queenside initiative. And here, well, it's interesting. Donchenko played very quickly at this moment. And he brought the bishop back to e2. He could have sacrificed here on e6. It's a really interesting move. And after g5, taken on g6 and then taken on e6. Now, it seems that black should be okay after this, but it's still pretty unclear. Certainly white can probably get a draw in this line. But bishop e2 played quickly. I mean, I'm guessing that Donchenko sort of trusted Caruana's opening analysis. c5. So it's a double-edged move considering that black's king is still in the middle of the board, opening up the position. Then again, white's king isn't in the best position and needs to really nudge to the side to b1. If this is taken, let's just have a very quick look at that. Then king b1, rook c8. It's a little bit uncomfortable for the queen. And black's queen has a nice square on b6. So Donchenko played in a very, very interesting way here. d5, really dynamic, which of course means that the c-file remains closed, so no problems with the king and queen together on the c-file. Sacrifices a pawn. and just wants to get going with f4. He could play bishop c3 here. That's also a very interesting move to open up the d-file and this diagonal here. But f4 also interesting after 20 minutes thought. Wants to try and move these pawns forward quickly on the king side. b4 after 35 minutes thought from Caruana. That was really his first big think in the game. And now, after 17 minutes thought, e4. So he's really going for it, Donchenko. He could have just nudged to the side with king b1, but e4 played. And now Caruana, I think, correctly decides to keep the centre closed with d4. At least keeping the d-file closed. But it does mean that that square is potentially available for white. And now, well, Donchenko, I think, understandably pressed on with e5, wanting to, try and get this storm going. Could have played king b1 and might have been more prudent. But e5 played. It's certainly a really tempting move. And here, well, c4 is really interesting for black. Just giving up that pawn in order to open up the c-file. But Caruana played instead knight b6, a little bit slower. And Donchenko should probably move the queen to e4. And, well, it's still just a very double-edged position, actually, even though black is a pawn up. But instead, well, he continued with his plan, this very tempting plan of splitting open these pawns to try and get the queen in and to break open black's king position. But Caruana reacted brilliantly here. He played queen d5, and that queen, well, controls that really important e4 square, but of course also looks in this direction. And after pawn takes pawn check, here's the clever bit. Now you could recapture with the king or the queen, but instead he played king f8. So it looks very odd. It looks as though, can this really be right? But in fact, black's king is covered by the pawn. It's covered by the bishop. There's basically enough cover that for the moment black's king is actually reasonably secure. Of course, black's king position is still ultimately a wreck. The point is, how strong is black's attack on the other side of the board? Has Caruana bought himself enough time to actually pursue the attack on the queen side? So this is threatened. So the obvious move here is b3. Now this did not happen. This did not take place. But let me just show you what could happen. Basically, black will crack open the A file like this. And in fact, the attack is incredibly strong. And it should actually be winning for black, this position. For example, I mean, this is just a sample line. d3, very dynamic. And now rook h3. Even this rook comes into play. Notice white can't touch black's king here. And this initiative is just overwhelming. Soon, all black's pieces will be attacking white's king. Now, that's not force, but it just gives you an idea of black's initiative. So the threat is queen a2, and Donchenko decided, okay, I'm just going to abandon that pawn and try and storm on the king side. So who's going to get through first? Queen takes a2. Queen takes g6. Both sides just kind of ignoring each other. It's very curious. b3. So now that means that the king is really getting caught in a box here. And there's no big hit against black's king. Bishop e1, that tries to give the king a little room. Perhaps freeze the rook a little bit. But c4, very powerful. with the idea potentially d3, potentially c3. It also opens up this diagonal for the bishop. So rook takes d4, knight a4, queen b2, obviously the threat. So then the queen came back. And now here, an absolute killer move from Caruana. Can you spot it? Bishop a3. Fantastic stuff. Now, if that's taken, then there's b2 check. Basically, this just wins by force. Queen b3 here, and the rook drops, and that's all over. So this is threatened. Bishop takes b2 is threatened. So Donchenko exchanged on a2. So it's hard to stop that one queening. But king c2, well, this sort of does it. So if black makes a queen, let's just have a quick look at that, then check. Bishop takes bishop, rook takes queen. And although white is a piece down, still in the game, it's still a very messy position. So Caruana decided not to promote. Instead, he found an absolutely decisive move. Very clever move. Rook b8. Now, the idea is this. If pawn takes bishop, rook check, and when we queen, that's checkmate. That really is decisive. If bishop b4 check, that at least stops black queening for the moment, but still, this is actually completely winning. Black is a piece up, and potentially rook b1 is coming there. Just had to avoid rook d8 check. So rook b8 has just been played. Donchenko gave up the rook to deflect black's rook, and then took the bishop. So now Caruana is the exchange up. Now just got to watch out for these checks, but actually c3 is a very efficient winning move. It blocks that check, and that means that a1 queen really is a threat. So if bishop takes c3, then rook c8 pins and wins. That just wins the bishop, and game over. That's a whole rook. So bishop g3 played, rook d2 check, king b3 and knight c5. That was the final move of the game. Donchenko resigned. So if, for example, king c4, then rook takes bishop, king takes c5, king takes pawn, black steal the exchange up, and rook c8 coming, and, well, one of these pawns is going to roll through, apart from anything else. Wow, what a dynamic game from Fabiano Caruana. I mean, that was really impressive, and I love the way that both sides kind of ignored each other, but, well, Caruana had worked out that his attack was actually stronger in the end, and that is a star move, king f8 in this position. Of course, that was foreseen a few moves in advance. But yeah, fascinating to see Caruana repeating his main opening from the candidates, not afraid to do that. What's he got prepared for the candidates? He doesn't want to give too much away. Anyway, that brings Caruana to 1.5 out of 2. In fact, Niels Grandelius from Sweden is leading the tournament with 2 out of 2, with 2 good wins so far. More to come. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. And do consider supporting us via Patreon or PayPal. Thanks for watching.